A broken throne, a hidden compartment, technology that could shift the balance of nuclear power in Europe, and a mall Santa who vanished the moment someone else sat in his chair. December 1983 represented the most dangerous moment in the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis 21 years earlier, a period when NATO had just begun deploying Pershing II ballistic missiles across West Germany in response to Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear missiles aimed at every major European capital. The Cleveland metropolitan area had become a critical node in American aerospace defense manufacturing, with TRW Incorporated producing guidance systems for intercontinental ballistic missiles in their Euclid facility and NASA Lewis Research Center developing advanced propulsion technologies just 15 miles from downtown, making the region a prime target for Soviet industrial espionage operations that had intensified dramatically after President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative in March of that same year. The KGB's Directorate T, responsible for stealing Western military technology, had shifted their operational focus from traditional diplomatic cover positions to deep cover agents embedded in American society for years or even decades, individuals who had built seemingly normal lives while waiting for activation orders that would require them to betray everything they had constructed in their adopted homeland. Mark Scott had spent 6 years working seasonal retail jobs at Northridge Mall while attending Cleveland State University part-time, pursuing an engineering degree that seemed to slip further away with each semester as his father's medical bills from the steel mill accident consumed every dollar the family could scrape together. He had worked as a stockroom clerk, a food court cashier, and for the past 2 holiday seasons as one of 3 rotating mall Santas, a job that paid $8 per hour and required him to maintain a patient smile while children pulled his synthetic beard and parents demanded impossible photograph angles in the cramped winter wonderland setup that the mall management erected every year between the Sears anchor store and the central fountain. His shift normally ran from 2 in the afternoon until 9 at night on weekdays, a schedule that allowed him to attend morning classes and still earn enough to cover his share of the rent in the apartment he shared with 2 other students in Cleveland Heights. But when Vladimir Sokolov called in sick on the morning of December 15th, with what the mall manager described as a severe case of bronchitis, Mark agreed to cover the opening shift that started at 10 in the morning and ran through 2 in the afternoon. The Northridge Mall Santa setup occupied a 2,000-square-foot section of the main concourse, decorated with artificial snow, mechanical reindeer that jerked their heads in rhythmic motions, and an elevated throne constructed from plywood and gold-painted foam that sat on a platform accessible by 4 carpeted steps. Vladimir Sokolov had been the primary morning Santa for 3 consecutive holiday seasons, arriving precisely at 9:45 every day to change into his costume in the employee break room and taking his position on the throne by 9:55, maintaining such rigid punctuality that mall security guards had joked about setting their watches by his arrival. The Ukrainian immigrant had worked as a night custodian at the Terminal Tower office complex downtown for 7 years, while his wife cleaned rooms at a Holiday Inn near the airport, and he had told Mark during their brief training session 3 years earlier that the Santa job represented a welcome change from scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans, an opportunity to interact with children and families in a way that reminded him of happier times in Kyiv before his family emigrated to the United States in 1976. The throne itself had developed a persistent mechanical problem over the past 2 weeks, with the seat cushion tilting forward whenever anyone over 200 pounds sat down, a defect that the mall maintenance crew had attempted to fix twice without success. Mark arrived at 9:30 that morning and found the winter wonderland area already crowded with mothers who had brought their children early to avoid the afternoon rush that typically stretched wait times to 90 minutes or more. He changed into the red velvet suit in the employee locker room and walked to the throne area, noticing immediately that the seat cushion was tilting at a more severe angle than he remembered from his last shift 3 days earlier. The first child, a 4-year-old girl in a green dress, climbed onto his lap and promptly began sliding forward, forcing Mark to brace his legs against the platform edge to prevent both of them from tumbling onto the artificial snow below. After the 5th near accident in 20 minutes, Mark called over Stephen Baker, the teenage photographer who operated the Polaroid camera station, and asked him to watch the line while Mark examined the throne mechanism during a brief pause between families. The seat cushion was attached to the plywood throne base with 6 brass screws, but when Mark tested the front left screw, it spun freely without catching any threads, indicating that the wood underneath had been stripped out by repeated repairs. He lifted the entire cushion assembly and discovered that someone had routed out a rectangular cavity in the plywood base measuring approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 3 inches deep, a space that had been carefully concealed by the cushion's fabric covering. Inside the cavity sat 17 small plastic cases, each one marked with white adhesive labels bearing handwritten numbers that appeared to be catalogue codes or inventory references. Mark opened the first case and found himself looking at 6 integrated circuit chips, nestled in grey anti-stat Ike foam, each chip roughly the size of a postage stamp with dozens of metallic pins extending from their black ceramic bodies. Stephen Baker glanced over at Mark, kneeling beside the disassembled throne. Families in line began murmuring about the delay. A mall security guard, Paul Adams, walked past the Winter Wonderland area on his regular patrol route. Mark closed the plastic case. His hands were shaking. The numbers on the labels looked like serial codes from an engineering lab. Vladimir Sokolov had called in sick exactly 12 hours ago. The throne had been fine 3 days earlier when Mark last worked this shift. Mark Scott picked up the plastic case again and saw more labels underneath. Different handwriting, dates going back 3 years, Christmas 1980, 1981, 1982. Always December, always the morning shift. He counted 17 cases total. The cavity could hold 20. Vladimir Sokolov had immigrated from Soviet Ukraine 7 years before taking this job. TRW Incorporated was 6 miles from this mall. Security guard Paul Adams was walking back toward the Santa area, looking directly at Mark, radio already moving toward his mouth. Paul Adams had worked mall security for 11 months, replacing a retired Cleveland police officer who had spent his final working years walking the corridors of Northridge Mall and breaking up teenage fights in the parking lot. But something about the way Adams moved suggested training that extended far beyond the 2-week certification course required for Ohio private security licenses. Mark had noticed it during their casual conversations over coffee in the food court, the way Adams instinctively positioned himself with his back to walls and maintained clear sight lines to all exits, the way his eyes tracked patterns rather than individual shoppers, and most tellingly, the way he had once mentioned spending time in West Berlin during his army service before catching himself and changing the subject to Cleveland Browns football. Adams reached the Santa throne area and stopped 3 feet from where Mark knelt beside the opened compartment, his hand resting on his radio, but not keying the transmit button, his face showing neither surprise nor alarm, but rather the careful neutrality of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment and was now calculating his next move based on variables that Mark could not begin to guess. The morning rush of families waiting for Santa photographs had created a crowd of approximately 40 people, stretching from the throne platform back toward the Walden Book storefront, mothers with strollers and fathers checking their watches, and children pointing at the mechanical reindeer that continued their jerking motions, despite the fact that Santa had abandoned his post to kneel beside a disassembled throne. Mark held the plastic case containing the integrated circuit chips in his left hand, while his right hand remained braced against the plywood base of the throne, and in that frozen moment, he understood that his next words would determine whether he spent the rest of the day answering questions in a mall security office, or whether something far more serious was about to unfold. Adams glanced at the plastic cases visible inside the compartment, then at the crowd of families, then back at Mark's face, and finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper that somehow carried complete authority despite its volume, telling Mark to close the compartment, reassemble the throne and finish his shift exactly as scheduled, while Adams made a phone call that would bring people who needed to see what Mark had found. Mark Scott spent the next 90 minutes sitting on the reassembled throne with 17 plastic cases hidden beneath the cushion that supported crying children and squirming toddlers, his synthetic beard soaked with sweat despite the mall's aggressive air conditioning, his mind racing through implications that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Vladimir Sokolov, had worked this exact shift for 3 consecutive holiday seasons, arriving early enough to access the throne before other employees or security guards began their rounds, sitting in a position that gave him clear visibility of the entire concourse, while appearing to be nothing more than a cheerful immigrant earning extra money during the Christmas season. The dates on the labels inside the compartment spanned 3 years, always December, suggesting a pattern of dead drops timed to coincide with the holiday shopping season when mall foot traffic reached its annual peak, and the presence of an additional Santa would attract zero attention from anyone. TRW incorporated manufactured guidance systems for Pershing II missiles in a facility that employed 12,000 workers. A NASA Lewis Research Center developed propulsion technologies with applications for both space exploration and military systems, and both facilities were located within a 15-mile radius of Northridge Mall, in suburbs connected by highways that Vladimir Sokolov could reach during his night custodian shift at Terminal Tower. Paul Adams returned to the Santa area at exactly 11:45, accompanied by 2 men in dark suits who did not identify themselves, but whose presence caused the mall's actual security supervisor to suddenly discover urgent business in another section of the building. The older of the 2 men, somewhere in his mid-40s with steel-gray hair cut in a military style, positioned himself near the exit closest to the parking lot, while his younger partner, perhaps 30 years old with the build of a college linebacker, stood near the entrance from the main concourse. Adams walked directly to the throne and told Mark that his shift was ending early, that a replacement Santa was being called in, and that Mark needed to accompany him to an office where some people wanted to discuss what he had found. The handoff took less than 3 minutes, with Mark changing out of the Santa costume in a supply closet rather than the main employee locker room, and then following Adams and the 2 suited men through a service corridor that connected the retail areas to the mall's administrative offices on the 2nd floor above the food court. The office they entered belonged to the mall's operations manager, but had been temporarily commandeered for purposes that became clear the moment Mark saw the equipment spread across the conference table. 2 leather briefcases lay open, revealing communication devices, cameras with telephoto lenses and file folders thick with photographs and documents. The younger suited man closed the door and locked it, while the older man pulled out a chair and gestured for Mark to sit, then placed a leather credential case on the table, showing a gold badge and an identification card that read Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Andrew Green introduced himself and his partner, Special Agent Stephen Scott, no relation to Mark despite the shared surname, and explained that the FBI had been investigating Soviet industrial espionage operations in the Cleveland aerospace manufacturing sector for 14 months, tracking the theft of classified technology from defense contractors and research facilities without being able to identify how the stolen materials were being transferred from the initial acquisition, points to the diplomatic couriers who would transport them out of the United States. Vladimir Sokolov had appeared on FBI surveillance reports 6 months earlier when a confidential informant at TRW Incorporated mentioned seeing a night custodian photographing documents left on an engineer's desk. But by the time agents had obtained authorization to investigate, Sokolov had transferred to a different building, and the engineer had been rotated to a non-classified project. The Bureau had placed Sokolov under periodic surveillance, but had never observed him making contact with known Soviet intelligence officers or visiting any of the suspected dead drop locations that the FBI had identified through signals intelligence and defector debriefings. The Santa position at Northridge Mall had seemed like exactly what it appeared to be, a seasonal job that supplemented Sokolov's custodian income, and the FBI had reduced their surveillance to occasional spot checks that never occurred during mall operating hours, when Sokolov would be sitting on a throne surrounded by children and families. Special Agent Green opened one of the file folders and spread 8 photographs across the table. Surveillance images showing 5 different individuals who all worked at Northridge Mall in various capacities. The photographs showed faces Mark recognized from 11 months of working in the mall. A woman who managed the Hickory Farms kiosk near the north entrance, a teenage stockroom worker at J.C. Penney, the assistant manager of the movie theater, a custodian who cleaned the food court, a gift-wrapping attendant at the information desk. Special Agent Green tapped each photograph in sequence and explained that the FBI had identified all 5 individuals as possible associates of Vladimir Sokolov based on immigration records, residential patterns, and financial transactions that suggested coordination. The woman at Hickory Farms had emigrated from Latvia in 1974. The stockroom worker's parents had come from East Germany in 1978. The theater manager was a naturalized Soviet citizen who had claimed refugee status in 1976. The custodian had arrived from Poland in 1979. The gift wrapper had no apparent connection to Eastern Europe, but had made 3 unexplained cash deposits totaling $12,000 in the past 8 months. None of them had ever been observed in direct contact with Vladimir Sokolov outside of normal mall interactions. Mark stared at the photograph spread across the conference table. 5 people, 5 different stores and work areas scattered throughout the mall. All of them perfectly positioned to observe traffic patterns, identify security routines, and move through the building without attracting attention. Special Agent Green placed the plastic cases containing the integrated circuit chips on the table beside the photographs. 17 cases. 3 years of dead drops. Vladimir Sokolov had called in sick for the first time in 3 holiday seasons. Someone had activated an emergency extraction protocol. The phone on the conference table started ringing. 3 sharp rings, then silence. Then 3 more rings. Special Agent Green picked up the receiver and listened without speaking. His face changed. He hung up and looked at his partner. Vladimir Sokolov had just been spotted entering Northridge Mall through the south entrance, walking toward the Santa throne area, carrying a large shopping bag. 12 minutes ago, he had been under surveillance at his apartment 6 miles away. Special Agent Andrew Green grabbed his radio and began issuing rapid instructions to FBI units positioned throughout Northridge Mall. Agents who had been posing as shoppers and maintenance workers for the past 6 hours, while waiting for exactly this kind of break in a case that had consumed 14 months of investigation, without producing a single prosecutable lead. The logistics of the situation presented immediate problems that Green had to solve in the 90 seconds between receiving confirmation of Vladimir Sokolov's entry and the moment when the target would reach the Santa throne area, because arresting Sokolov immediately would burn their surveillance on the other 5 suspected network members and potentially alert a Soviet handler who remained unidentified despite hundreds of hours of analysis. Green made the decision to let Sokolov reach the throne compartment and discover that the integrated circuit chips had been found, gambling that the pressure of exposure would force the entire network to activate whatever emergency protocols they had established for exactly this scenario. Protocols that might finally reveal the identity of the KGB officer running the operation from somewhere in the Cleveland area. Vladimir Sokolov moved through the mall concourse with the careful but not hurried pace of a man who understood that running would attract exactly the kind of attention that his training had taught him to avoid at all costs, carrying a Lord & Taylor shopping bag that hung heavy with contents that FBI surveillance teams watching through telephoto lenses from the 2nd floor walkway could not identify without risk of exposure. He passed the Hickory Farms kiosk where Victoria Lebedev was arranging gift baskets for the afternoon rush, and although neither individual acknowledged the other in any visible way, Special Agent Stephen Scott noticed through his binoculars that Lebedev's hands stopped moving for exactly 3 seconds when Sokolov walked past, a micropause that suggested communication through some prearranged signal system. Sokolov continued toward the Santa throne area, where a different mall employee now sat in the red velvet suit, a substitute Santa who had been hired that morning and knew nothing about the compartment hidden beneath the cushion he sat upon. The line of families waiting for photographs had grown to nearly 60 people, and the crowd provided perfect cover for Sokolov to approach the throne area without standing out from the normal flow of mall traffic. Mark Scott remained in the operations manager's office with the 17 plastic cases spread across the conference table. Each case now photographed and catalogued by FBI technicians who had arrived within minutes of Green's phone call to the Cleveland field office. The integrated circuit chips represented technology that the Soviets would pay enormous sums to acquire. Components that could be reverse-engineered to match or exceed American capabilities in missile guidance systems that currently gave NATO a significant tactical advantage in any potential European conflict. Each chip contained thousands of microscopic transistors arranged in patterns that had required years of research and hundreds of millions of dollars in development costs, and the theft of even a single prototype could save Soviet weapons designers months or years of trial and error, while simultaneously revealing to Moscow exactly what capabilities American missiles possessed. The chips in these 17 cases represented approximately 3 years of accumulated theft from TRW Incorporated and NASA Lewis Research Center, suggesting that Vladimir Sokolov or his network had maintained access to classified facilities throughout that entire period, despite security measures that included background checks, armed guards, and strict protocols for handling sensitive materials. Special Agent Green received confirmation through his earpiece that all 5 suspected network members were currently at their workstations throughout the mall, a concentration that could not be coincidental given Vladimir Sokolov's sudden appearance after calling in sick 12 hours earlier. The woman at Hickory Farms had just stepped away from her kiosk and was walking toward the payphones near the south entrance. The stockroom worker at JCPenney had left his post and was heading toward the loading dock. The theater manager had closed her office door. The food court custodian had abandoned his mop bucket in the middle of the corridor. The gift wrapper at the information desk was speaking urgently into the mall's internal telephone system. Green watched through the office window as the network synchronized their movements with the precision of a military operation, each member moving to a different location that would provide coverage of multiple exit points and sight lines throughout the building. Vladimir Sokolov reached the Santa throne and stopped 6 feet from the platform, his eyes scanning the crowd of families before focusing on the throne itself. The substitute Santa bounced a crying infant on his lap, while the photographer struggled with a malfunctioning Polaroid camera. Sokolov set his shopping bag down beside a decorative candy cane and knelt as if tying his shoe, a position that gave him a clear view underneath the throne platform. His hand reached toward the base of the throne, stopped, pulled back. He had seen that the compartment had been opened. The brass screws were in different positions. Someone had found the cache. Sokolov stood and picked up his shopping bag, turned toward the nearest exit, started walking. Special Agent Green spoke 3 words into his radio. The FBI units positioned throughout the mall began moving toward predetermined interception points. Vladimir Sokolov increased his pace without quite breaking into a run. The woman from Hickory Farms appeared from behind a column near the food court and made eye contact with him. A signal passed between them. Sokolov changed direction, heading toward the north entrance instead of the south exit. The JCPenney stockroom worker emerged from a service corridor and positioned himself to block FBI agents moving from that direction. The theater manager opened an emergency exit door that should have been alarmed, but produced no sound. The food court custodian knocked over a trash can, creating a spill that forced shoppers to detour around the obstruction. The gift wrapper triggered the fire alarm system. 3,000 shoppers started moving toward exits simultaneously. The mall erupted into controlled chaos as families gathered children and store employees began following evacuation protocols. Vladimir Sokolov disappeared into the crowd, flowing toward the north entrance. Special Agent Green lost visual contact. Radio traffic exploded, with confused reports from FBI units trying to track multiple targets through masses of civilians. The woman from Hickory Farms vanished into a Sears store. The stockroom worker ducked into an employee restroom. The theater manager was gone. The custodian had abandoned his position. Only the gift wrapper remained at the information desk, calmly helping an elderly woman locate an exit while mall security guards shouted instructions that no one could hear over the fire alarm. Mark Scott stood at the office window and watched 3 years of FBI investigation collapse into chaos. Somewhere in that crowd of evacuating shoppers, 5 Soviet agents were executing an extraction plan. They had probably rehearsed 100 times. The fire alarm continued its deafening pulse. Special Agent Green was shouting into his radio about perimeter teams and vehicle checkpoints. The shopping bag Vladimir Sokolov had been carrying sat abandoned beside the Santa throne. No one had secured it yet. Mark could see it from the second-floor window. Black canvas, Lord and Taylor logo, sitting alone in the rapidly emptying concourse, starting to smoke. The Cleveland Fire Department bomb disposal unit reached the smoking shopping bag 17 minutes after the mall evacuation began, their robot arm carefully lifting the Lord and Taylor bag to reveal not an explosive device, but rather a thermite incendiary charge designed to destroy documents and physical evidence without causing casualties or structural damage to the surrounding area. The device had malfunctioned, producing smoke instead of the intense 2,000-degree burn that would have reduced the bag's contents to slag and ash, and when FBI technicians finally examined what Vladimir Sokolov had been carrying, they found 12 additional plastic cases containing integrated circuit chips, a ledger written in a cipher that would take NSA cryptanalysts 6 weeks to break, and $3,000 in used $20 bills wrapped in rubber bands. The thermite charge had been rigged with a timer set to activate 30 minutes after Sokolov entered the mall, giving him enough time to retrieve the chips from the throne compartment, add them to the cases he was carrying, and exit the building before the evidence of 3 years of espionage burned away completely. But Mark Scott's discovery had disrupted that timeline and forced Sokolov to abandon both the new chips and the existing cache in a desperate attempt to escape before FBI agents could close the perimeter around Northridge Mall. Special Agent Andrew Green coordinated the response from a mobile command post that the FBI established in the mall parking lot within 20 minutes of the evacuation, directing 43 agents and 67 Cleveland Police Department officers in a dragnet that covered a 2-mile radius around the shopping complex. Vladimir Sokolov had vanished into the crowd of evacuating shoppers and had not been spotted by any of the perimeter teams, despite photographs of his face being distributed to every officer within minutes of the fire alarm activation. The woman from Hickory Farms, Victoria Lebedev, had been detained near the north parking lot when an alert FBI agent recognized her from the surveillance photographs, but she had immediately invoked her right to remain silent and requested an attorney, providing no information beyond confirming her name and address. The JCPenney stockroom worker had escaped through a delivery truck that had been making a scheduled pickup at the loading dock, and Cleveland police had lost the vehicle in traffic near Interstate 77 before roadblocks could be established. The theater manager had disappeared completely, last seen entering the emergency exit she had opened, but never emerging on the other side, according to agents who had covered all possible routes from that location. The food court custodian had been arrested while attempting to board a Greyhound bus to Detroit, and the gift wrapper had walked out the main entrance with a group of elderly shoppers and had not been seen since. Mark Scott spent the next 8 hours being debriefed by FBI agents who documented every detail of his discovery, from the moment he had noticed the broken throne mechanism to the instant when he had opened the compartment and found the plastic cases filled with stolen military technology. The Bureau's counterintelligence division had been pursuing Soviet industrial espionage operations in the aerospace manufacturing sector since the late 1970s, but the networks had proven remarkably difficult to penetrate because the KGB had learned from earlier failures and had shifted to using deep-cover illegals who had no obvious connection to Soviet diplomatic facilities or known intelligence officers. The Northridge Mall network represented exactly this kind of operation, with 5 agents who had built ordinary American lives over periods ranging from 7 to 9 years while waiting for tasking that would activate them for specific collection missions. The integrated circuit chips that Mark had found represented the largest single seizure of stolen aerospace technology in FBI history, components whose loss would set Soviet missile guidance programs back by an estimated 18 to 24 months, according to Defense Department analysts who had examined the recovered cases. The investigation that followed Mark's discovery would eventually lead to the identification of 17 additional Soviet agents operating in Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago, all of them connected through a network that had been recruiting and training deep-cover operatives since the early 1970s. Vladimir Sokolov had been the network's primary technical collector, using his position as a night custodian to access buildings after normal security staff had completed their rounds, photographing documents and stealing prototype components that he would then pass to a handler through the dead drop hidden in the Santa throne during the Christmas season when his presence at the mall would attract zero suspicion. The 5 other Northridge Mall employees had served as surveillance specialists and emergency support, monitoring FBI activity in the area and providing backup plans for extraction if the network ever faced exposure. The fire alarm activation had been their final contingency protocol, a method of creating mass confusion that would allow priority agents like Sokolov to escape while lower-value members like Victoria Lebedev drew FBI attention through their capture. FBI agents found Vladimir Sokolov 48 hours after the mall evacuation, living under a false identity in a safe house in Toledo, Ohio, approximately 120 miles from Cleveland. He had been preparing to cross into Canada when a joint FBI and Royal Canadian Mounted Police operation intercepted him at a farmhouse 3 miles from the border. Sokolov agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony over the next 6 months would expose the full scope of Soviet industrial espionage operations targeting American aerospace companies throughout the Midwest. He revealed that the KGB had specifically chosen the Santa Throne as a dead-drop location, because the seasonal nature of the job meant that no single employee would occupy the position year-round, and the presence of children and families provided natural cover that made surveillance extremely difficult for American counterintelligence. The plastic cases had been supplied by his handler, a Soviet officer operating under diplomatic cover at the consulate in Chicago, and the collection of chips had been planned to continue through at least 1985 before the entire cache would be shipped to Moscow through a courier network that used diplomatic pouches to move stolen technology out of the United States. The trial of Victoria Lebedev and the food court custodian, whose real name turned out to be Vyacheslav Kozlov, began in federal court in Cleveland 14 months after their arrest and resulted in convictions on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage and theft of national defense information. Lebedev received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, while Kozlov was sentenced to 18 years after providing limited cooperation with investigators. Vladimir Sokolov pleaded guilty to espionage charges and received a 30-year sentence that would eventually be reduced to 22 years for his extensive cooperation with the FBI. The JCPenney stockroom worker was never found, and FBI analysts concluded that he had likely been extracted to the Soviet Union through Canada or Mexico. The theater manager's body was discovered in the Detroit River 6 weeks after the evacuation, showing signs of execution-style murder that suggested the KGB had eliminated her as a security risk. The gift wrapper remained at large until 1991, when she was identified living in East Germany, and was arrested after German reunification led to the opening of Stasi archives that contained records of her true identity. Mark Scott completed his engineering degree at Cleveland State University in May of 1985, graduating with honors and receiving job offers from 3 aerospace companies, including TRW Incorporated, which had been impressed by his role in exposing the espionage network that had been stealing their technology. He accepted a position as a junior engineer at NASA Lewis Research Center, where he worked on propulsion systems for the Space Shuttle program and eventually rose to senior management before retiring in 2015. The FBI paid him a $20,000 reward for information, leading to the arrest and conviction of Soviet agents, money that Mark used to pay off his father's medical bills and complete his final 2 years of university without needing to work retail jobs. He never worked as a mall Santa again, but he kept the synthetic beard from his final shift in a box in his basement, a reminder of the morning when a broken throne and a missing colleague had revealed a network of spies that had been operating in plain sight for 3 years. Special Agent Andrew Green received a commendation from the FBI director for his handling of the Northridge Mall case, which became a training example for counterintelligence operations at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He continued investigating Soviet espionage operations throughout the 1980s and eventually became the special agent in charge of the Cleveland field office before retiring in 2003. Paul Adams, whose real name was classified but who had spent 11 months working undercover as a mall security guard, returned to regular FBI duties after the case concluded and was later assigned to counter-terrorism operations following the attacks of September 11, 2001. The Northridge Mall continued operating until 2008, when declining sales and competition from newer shopping centers forced its closure, and the Winter Wonderland area where Mark Scott had discovered the hidden compartment was demolished along with the rest of the building in 2010. The Santa Throne was preserved as evidence and remains in FBI storage to this day. A piece of Cold War history that serves as a reminder that espionage operations often hide in the most ordinary and unexpected places.